Instead, the ventral hatches under the bellies of the flying cigars slid open. From the dark recesses of their heavy, boiler-like hulls, a volley of strange, oversized rocket projectiles hissed outward, leaving thick, corkscrewing trails of gray smoke in their wake. "They're firing blind," Baumbach laughed over the radio. "They're launching rockets from half a kilometer away. The desperate fools are completely panicking." Lent didn't laugh. His combat instinct, honed by 100 night battles, detected a flaw in the scene. The rockets weren't tracking toward the German fighters like standard air-to-air projectiles. They were exploding prematurely, bursting into thick, black clouds of shrapnel hundreds of meters ahead of the Soviet formation. Puff, puff, puff.
The black bursts looked harmless, like poorly aimed anti-aircraft fire from the ground. Lent prepared to squeeze his trigger, his finger tightening on the stick button. He was 400 meters away now, closing fast, entirely out of the effective range of any known Soviet defensive weapon. Suddenly, a massive, concussive shockwave slammed into Lent's fighter. There was no sound of a gun firing. There was no tracer fire cutting through the air. A rocket that had seemed to miss by over 50 meters suddenly detonated with a blinding orange flash directly parallel to his wingman's Messerschmitt. What the hell was... Before the wingman could finish his sentence, another black cloud erupted right in front of his propeller hub. The explosion didn't wait for impact. The moment the German fighter drew level with the flying projectile, the rocket exploded automatically, as if it possessed a mind of its own. The blast tore the port wing completely off the Bf-109, sending the fighter into a violent, fiery spin toward the sunflowers below. "Break! Break away!" Lent screamed into his radio, his heart hammering against his ribs as a shower of jagged shrapnel rattled against his own armored windshield. The air around them was turning into a localized minefield. The primitive flying cigars weren't panicking at all. They were laying down a wall of automated, self-detonating death that didn't need to hit a target to destroy it. August 16th, 1943. 1443 hours. 9,000 feet over the Dnieper River. The sky was unraveling. Inside the cockpit of his twisting Messerschmitt, Major Helmut Lent fought the controls as a series of violent, invisible hands slapped at his aircraft. The air was thick with the acrid, sulfurous stench of high explosives. Everywhere he looked, the sky was blossoming with those sudden, terrifying orange flashes, followed instantly by dense, greasy puffs of black smoke. "My engine is hit! I'm losing pressure!" Lieutenant Baumbach's voice was no longer arrogant. It was a high-pitched, panicked shriek over the radio static. Through his side canopy, Lent saw Baumbach's Bf-109 shudder violently. A rocket had detonated nearly 40 meters above the German fighter, yet the cone of downward spraying shrapnel had shredded his cowling like paper, unleashing a torrent of black oil across his windshield. "Pull out, Werner! Climb!" Lent yelled, pulling his stick back into a steep banking turn to evade the invisible kill zones. It defied every rule of aerial combat the Luftwaffe had mastered. Standard tactics dictated that an unguided air-to-air rocket required a direct impact or a precisely timed mechanical delay fuse set by the pilot before takeoff. To trigger a delay fuse accurately against a fighter diving at 400 miles per hour was nearly impossible. Yet these Soviet rockets were detonating with pinpoint, lethal synchronization, the exact millisecond a German aircraft drew near.
Lent rolled his fighter inverted, looking down at the belly of a flying cigar passing beneath him. He could see the strange, bulbous glass and plastic nose cones of the heavy rockets remaining in their launcher rails. They weren't standard munitions. What the Luftwaffe aces didn't know, what their intelligence officers had completely failed to identify, was that the clumsy iron hulls of these Soviet planes were acting as airborne cradles for a revolutionary secret weapon supplied via Lend-Lease, the British-American VT proximity fuse. Inside each rocket nose cone sat a miniature ruggedized radio transmitter and receiver. As the rocket streaked through the air, it continuously blathered a low-power radio signal into the void. The moment a German aluminum fuselage crossed into that radio wave, the signal bounced back, completed the circuit, and triggered the detonator automatically. The flying cigar didn't need to aim. It just had to fill the sky with radio noise. They aren't aiming at us, Lent realized with cold horror as a rocket detonated 20 meters off his tail, shattering his rudder controls and sending a vibration screaming through his floorboards. The rockets are finding us! Another Bf-109 from the formation, flown by a young underofficer on his first combat sortie, attempted to press home a desperate gun run on the Soviet lead plane. He dove vertically, trying to exploit the blunt aircraft's blind spot. But the Soviet rear gunner wasn't even aiming at the fighter. He fired a specialized short-range mortar canister into the path of the dive. The canister broadcasted its lethal whisper. At 50 yards away from the canopy, it detected the mass of the German engine block. Boom. The explosion was instantaneous and absolute. The young pilot's Messerschmitt didn't just catch fire, it disintegrated into a cloud of molten aluminum and flying scrap metal, passing through the black smoke like a ghost made of garbage. "Adler Squadron, abort! Break off the attack!" Lent commanded, his voice cracking. He slammed his throttle forward into war emergency power, desperately trying to drag his crippled fighter out of the lethal web of radio-detonated shrapnel. The hunters had become the prey, and the toy they had laughed at was methodically erasing them from the sky.
August 16th, 1943, 1450 hours, 4,000 feet over the burning sunflower fields. The retreat was a frantic, uncoordinated dive for survival. Major Helmut Lent jammed his rudder pedal down with all the strength left in his leg, fighting the sluggish response of his severed control cables. His Messerschmitt was bleeding altitude rapidly, leaving a thin trail of white coolant vapor across the sky. Behind him, the sky was still actively chewing up his squadron. Of the 4 pristine fighters that had aggressively dove into the trap 10 minutes ago, only 2 remained airborne. Lautmann Baumbach's fighter was gone, swallowed by a massive fireball when a proximity-fused rocket detonated directly beneath his fuel cell. "Major, they're staying on our tail! They're diving with us!" shouted the last surviving wingman, his voice frantic as his engine coughed under the strain of structural damage. Lent glanced into his rearview mirror. The 12 flying cigars were no longer maintaining their rigid defensive posture. They had shifted into a loose, aggressive pursuit line. They were slow, yes, but gravity was a universal equalizer in a dive. The heavy, boilerplate hulls of the Soviet planes gathered terrifying momentum as they plunged after the crippled German fighters, their open underbelly bays continually spitting out the bulbous, radio-fused projectiles. Puff, puff, flash. The automated death followed them down. The proximity fuses didn't care about the Luftwaffe's superior aerodynamics or the pilot's decades of combined combat experience. The radio waves blathered out from the rocket noses continuously, bouncing off the retreating Messerschmitts, mapping the distance in microseconds, and detonating the high-explosive warheads with cold, mathematical certainty. Lent saw a flash in his peripheral vision. The wingman's fighter was slapped sideways by a detonation 20 meters to his right. The concussive force blew the canopy clean off the cockpit, and the pilot was thrown out into the slipstream, his parachute instantly blossoming against the dark backdrop of the smoke. Lent was entirely alone. He flattened his dive just above the treetops, the yellow heads of the infinite sunflower fields blurring beneath his battered fuselage. Up ahead, the grass runway of his home airfield materialized through the smoke of the burning river crossing. The ground crews and mechanics who had laughed at the flying cigar just 2 days prior were now running for the deep concrete split trenches as the sky above them screamed with a terrifying automated fury. Lent chopped his throttle, dropping his landing gear with a pneumatic hiss just as his engine seized completely, spitting a final violent cloud of black oil over his canopy. The Messerschmitt bounced violently onto the dirt runway, its left tire blown by shrapnel, causing the fighter to ground loop violently before sliding to a halt in a cloud of dust and dry grass right in front of the squadron hut. Lent threw open his canopy, coughing violently as he dragged his bruised body out of the cockpit. He collapsed onto the wing, his eyes fixed on the sky. High above the airfield, the 12 Soviet aircraft swam through the black puffs of their own ordnance, completely untouchable. They didn't drop standard bombs. They didn't need to. They